ambition, deception, and a monumental reckoning. Watch how one man's rise to power was eclipsed by his arrogance, proving that no one is above the law. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, the air thick with the murmur of whispered conversations. It was a spectacle, every seat taken, every eye on the entrance. The whispers swirled like smoke, each one more outrageous than the last. Then he appeared. Lucas Hawke, tall, impeccably dressed in a custom-tailored black suit, his posture perfect, the very image of authority. The man walked in with a swagger, his eyes scanning the room as if he were surveying an audience that had gathered to applaud, not to judge. The smirk on his face was barely concealed, a hint of mockery in his every step. Lucas Hawke, the name that had captured the headlines for months, looked more like a VIP guest than a defendant facing the charges of embezzling millions from hard-working families. But it wasn't his arrival that caused the stir, it was the moment when Judge Ariana Daniels walked in. Her presence was magnetic. Dressed in the traditional black robe, she moved with a calm, unyielding authority that seemed to settle the entire room. The murmurs died instantly, and all eyes turned to her. She didn't need to command attention, it was given freely, earned through years of unwavering commitment to justice. All rise for the Honorable Judge Ariana Daniels, the bailiff announced. The crowd stood, their eyes glued to the figure at the bench. Except Lucas. A ripple of disbelief washed over the courtroom as Lucas remained seated, flipping through a legal pad like it was any ordinary day. His defense attorney leaned in, whispering urgently, but Lucas, unfazed, waved him off with an arrogant flick of his wrist. Judge Daniels paused for a moment, her gaze unwavering, her face an impassive mask. The silence grew, heavy, as if the room held its breath. The tension was unbearable, the crowd's disbelief palpable. Mr. Hawke, Judge Daniels spoke, her voice steady but filled with an underlying force. Please rise. But Lucas, still with that same smug smile, leaned back in his chair and muttered, "No need." The courtroom gasped. The judge's eyes flashed with something far deeper than surprise. She said nothing, but the entire room could feel the weight of her resolve. "You may be seated, Mr. Hawke," she said, her voice cool yet firm. Lucas smirked, but the atmosphere had already shifted. The room was no longer just tense, it was suffocating. The trial was about to begin, and Lucas Hawke, for all his wealth and influence, was about to realize that arrogance could only shield you for so long. Lucas's defense attorney, Gavin Hughes, adjusted his glasses nervously, glancing between his client and the judge. He was a seasoned lawyer, but even he could sense the gravity of the situation. Hughes leaned in, whispering urgently to Lucas. "You have to show some respect, Lucas. This is a court of law." But Lucas, barely acknowledging his attorney, stared straight ahead, his gaze unwavering, as if the proceedings were beneath him. The prosecutor, Maria Sinclair, stood up next, exuding a quiet confidence. She was young, but sharp, a rising star in the legal world, and she'd been determined to take Lucas down ever since the first whispers of his corruption began. She approached the podium, her eyes never leaving the defendant. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court, today is about more than just money. It's about justice. It's about accountability." Her voice rang out, crisp and clear. Lucas Hawke has used his power to manipulate, to steal from those who trusted him. He's taken what wasn't his, and today, we make him answer for it. Lucas shifted slightly in his chair, his fingers drumming against the armrest. His arrogance remained unshaken, but even he could feel the heat of the prosecutor's words. Judge Daniels, with her calm composure, nodded slightly, her eyes fixed on Lucas. "Mr. Hawke, you will have your chance to respond in due time. I advise you to control your demeanor." Lucas's smirk widened, but it was less certain now, more forced. As the trial proceeded, the evidence against Lucas mounted with each passing hour. Documents were presented, detailed records, spreadsheets, emails that linked him to illicit financial transactions stretching back years. Witness after witness testified, each one confirming his involvement, each one describing how they had been manipulated, silenced, or threatened. One witness, Clara Simmons, a former employee who had once worked as an executive at one of Lucas's companies, broke down in tears on the stand. She spoke of how she had been coerced into signing falsified documents, how her career had been destroyed when she refused to comply with Lucas's demands. There were threats, personal threats, Clara said, her voice quivering. He said if I didn't do what he wanted, he'd make sure no one would hire me again. The courtroom was silent, and Lucas's expression remained unchanged, calculating, cold. But the truth was unraveling before him, and for the first time, he was beginning to sense the weight of what was coming. Hours stretched on, and the prosecution painted a damning picture, piece by piece. The judge didn't flinch once, her gaze never leaving Lucas. It was as though she was studying him, reading him, understanding the very heart of his corruption. Finally, it was Lucas's turn. He stood, straightening his suit, and his arrogance seemed to fill the entire room as he walked to the defense table. With a smirk still playing at the corners of his lips, Lucas began his defense. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice dripping with insincerity, "I'm a businessman. I've created jobs, I've built industries. No one here can claim I've done anything less than that." The audience shifted uncomfortably, but Lucas pressed on. "Yes, I've made mistakes," he said, his tone now almost mocking, "but who hasn't? In the world of business, you take risks. You do what's necessary to stay on top. If that means bending a few rules, then so be it." His eyes gleamed with defiance as he scanned the room. "I did what I had to do to succeed. You should all be thanking me." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. No one spoke. Judge Daniels's lips thinned as she gave him a look that could have burned through steel. "You've just admitted to the very crimes you're accused of, Mr. Hawke," she said, her voice low but steady. "The law doesn't care about your success in business. It only cares about justice." Lucas faltered for a split second, but quickly regained his composure. "Justice?" he scoffed. "You call this justice? What's happening here is a witch hunt. I am being attacked because of my success, my hard work." The crowd's reaction was immediate, a mix of murmurs, some of disbelief, others of contempt. But Judge Daniels wasn't swayed. Her voice grew colder, more commanding. "This is not about your success, Mr. Hawke. It's about your abuse of power, your manipulation, and your greed. And make no mistake, you will answer for it." For the first time, Lucas's confidence seemed to waver. The cracks were beginning to show. His empire, built on lies and deception, was crumbling before his eyes. The hours ticked on, and the prosecution delivered their closing arguments with power and precision. Maria Sinclair left no stone unturned, showing how Lucas had manipulated the legal system, bribed officials, and used his influence to destroy anyone who dared stand in his way. By the time she finished, the room was left in stunned silence. Then came the defense's turn. Gavin Hughes spoke briefly, but it was clear that his heart wasn't in it. He knew the battle was lost. Still, he argued Lucas's case as best as he could, calling attention to his client's philanthropic efforts and business achievements. But no one was listening. Not anymore. Judge Daniels gave her final instructions, and the jury filed out, leaving behind a room charged with anticipation. Lucas Hawke sat in his chair, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists. For the first time, he wasn't in control. The wait seemed like an eternity, the tension building with every passing second. Finally, the jury returned. They took their seats, and all eyes were on them. Judge Daniels nodded toward the foreperson. "Will the jury please deliver its verdict?" she asked, her voice unwavering. The room held its breath. The foreperson stood, holding the paper in trembling hands. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Lucas Hawk, guilty of all charges." A gasp went through the courtroom. Lucas's face drained of color, his earlier bravado evaporating in an instant. His smirk was gone. He stood motionless, the weight of his fate crashing down on him. "Here's the transcript with all timestamps removed." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, the air thick with disbelief. For the first time in years, Lucas felt the cold grip of reality tightening around him. The power he had once wielded so effortlessly now seemed distant, unreachable. He glanced at his attorney, Gavin Hughes, whose face mirrored his own shock. Neither spoke, there was nothing left to say. Judge Daniels raised her hand, demanding silence. "I will now hear the sentencing." Her voice was steady, though the tension in the room was palpable. Lucas stood frozen, his pulse racing, as the judge turned toward the prosecution. Maria Sinclair approached the bench, her expression stern but not without a hint of satisfaction. "Your Honor," she began, "Lucas Hawk's actions have caused immeasurable damage. The corruption, the manipulation, the harm done to countless people cannot be overlooked. We ask for the maximum sentence." The words hit Lucas like a physical blow. The maximum sentence. His chest tightened, his mind spinning as he tried to process what it meant. Was this really happening? Was this the end of everything? He remembered the days when he could silence any threat with a single word. When power and influence had been his to command. Now, those same forces were turning against him, and no amount of wealth or status could protect him. Gavin Hughes stood, his voice softer now. "Your Honor, we ask for leniency. My client acknowledges his mistakes, though he remains firm in his belief that his actions were always in the best interest of his businesses. He is willing to make restitution, to pay for his wrongdoings." Lucas couldn't believe what he was hearing. Gavin's plea felt weak, hollow. It wasn't enough. Nothing would be enough. Judge Daniels didn't immediately respond. She looked down at the papers in front of her, the weight of the decision clearly bearing down on her. Then, slowly, she raised her eyes to meet Lucas's. "Lucas Hawk, you've had a long and prosperous career built on lies and manipulation. But today, the truth has come to light. You have betrayed the trust of everyone who ever believed in you." She paused, her gaze never leaving his. "Your actions have led to ruined lives, shattered families, and irreparable damage to the businesses you once controlled. You are not above the law. The sentence will reflect the severity of your crimes." Lucas's breath caught in his throat. He felt his legs weaken, his vision starting to blur. He fought to maintain his composure, but inside, he was spiraling. This was real. It was all slipping away. The judge turned toward the jury. "Do you have anything else to add before I pass sentence?" she asked. The foreperson nodded, standing up. "We, the jury, feel strongly that Mr. Hawk's actions deserve to be punished to the fullest extent. We believe that such behavior must be deterred for the sake of justice and the safety of others." Lucas's eyes flickered toward the jury, and for the first time, he saw something resembling pity in their eyes. But it was fleeting, soon replaced by the cold resolve of those who had made up their minds. It was over. Judge Daniels nodded. "Then, Mr. Hawke, it is with regret that I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole." The words echoed in the room, the finality of the sentence hanging in the air like a thick fog. Lucas didn't speak. He couldn't. His tongue felt heavy in his mouth, as though he had lost the ability to form words. All his life, he had fought to maintain control, but now that control had slipped through his fingers. He felt the eyes of the courtroom upon him, some with sympathy, others with disdain, but all of them had one thing in common: they had all witnessed the fall of a man who had once thought himself invincible. As the bailiffs moved to take him into custody, Lucas turned toward the door, the cold steel of reality closing in around him. His empire was gone. His name, once synonymous with success, would now be remembered for corruption, deceit, and betrayal. As the courtroom emptied, Maria Sinclair stood at the front, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. This case had been more than just a victory. It had been a symbol of the fight for justice, the fight against those who believed they were untouchable. She had spent years preparing for this moment, and now, finally, she could breathe a little easier. Lucas Hawke had been brought to justice. But she couldn't shake the feeling that, in some ways, the battle had just begun. There were more people like Lucas out there, more people who thought the rules didn't apply to them. And Maria had every intention of bringing them down one by one. As for Lucas, he would have a long time to think about his choices in that prison cell. The world would move on. His name would become a footnote in history, a warning of what happens when power is abused, when greed outweighs integrity. Lucas's final walk down the courthouse steps was a far cry from the confident, triumphant entrances he had once made. Now, he was a shadow of the man who had once stood at the top. His hands were cuffed, his head bowed, and the only sound that filled the air was the flash of cameras capturing the fall of a titan. And though he would try to rebuild, to rise again from the ashes of his once great empire, Lucas Hawke knew in his heart that the world had already moved on without him. His legacy was no longer one of success, but of downfall, a cautionary tale of the price of power.